Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin. Wake me up when September ends. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. That sale is about to end. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, I was curious how many times I've made this video, and it turns out this will be the fourth year in a row that we've made this video at the very beginning of September. And the general idea is that September oftentimes, but not always, okay, offers unfavorable seasonality. Now, as we learned last year, seasonality is not everything. And I said that in the video, right? That just because September is usually red does not mean that it is always red. And last year, we actually had a green September. You can see September of 2023, the market went up about 4%. Now, what was interesting back then was that usually September is red. And we can actually look at this table right here. And so basically I started noticing a pattern for Bitcoin. Um, and essentially what it was that we just had red September after red September after red September, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. So then in 2021, I made the Wake Me Up When September Ends video, basically saying, all right, guys, we're probably going to get a drop in September. And then the following year, I made one, and Bitcoin dropped again. And then the following year, I made one, and Bitcoin went up 4%. And so this goes to show that just because Bitcoin typically goes down in September does not mean that it always does. And there's actually evidence to support both views. We'll talk a little bit about that. But it's kind of similar to like February, right? February tends to be green. In fact, there have been only 3 Februaries that have been red for Bitcoin: 2020, 2014, and 2012. Every other February for Bitcoin has in fact been green, but that doesn't mean that every February will be green. Same thing goes with September. Really, what it is it's unfavorable seasonality around the August to September timeframe. And if you take the average return of Bitcoin in August, it's negative 1.9%. Now, it's not statistically significant, right? You can't go into August thinking that the return is going to be negative 1.9% because one standard deviation plus or minus 23.2%. And part of the reason for that is because, well, back in 2011, Bitcoin dropped about 39.6% in August. And then you can see there have been some pretty good months, some pretty good times in the past where August actually saw Bitcoin go up. But on average, right, Bitcoin, the only 2 months of the year, on average, where Bitcoin goes down is August and September. And that's actually going back to 2010. If you take us, say, only back to 2015 or something, you ignore this, like, bad August in 2011, you'll see that the only 2 times, right, are what? January and September. But in this case, September is the one that kind of sticks around, right, as the red one, right? If you take it from 2013, it's September and June. If you take it from 2019, it's June, August, and September. If you take it from 2021, right, you can see it's September and quite a bit others, because of course we had a pretty bad bear market in 2022. And then a lot of these months in 2024 haven't been that great either. So what you'll notice, though, no matter how you look at your averages, no matter what years you ignore, September tends to not be that great. But there are some silver linings. For instance, if you were to look at when Bitcoin has been green in September, there's been 4 times. One of those was last year. The other 2 times were 2016, which was a Bitcoin halving year, just like this halving year, and 2012, which was also a Bitcoin halving year. And while 2012 isn't really that similar to what we're seeing today, if you were to look at 2016, Bitcoin also dropped about 8% in August, just like Bitcoin dropped 8% this August. And a lot of people have made that comparison to 2016. Though I have found that a lot of the people that made the comparison to 2016 were more so doing it back in March, and we're using it to say, this is why Bitcoin was going to go to all-time highs in the summer. And now they're using it to say the same thing. But you have to be careful, right? I mean, it is possible that Bitcoin follows that path, right? Where it actually ends up being green in September, just like 2016 and just like 2012. One of the interesting things that we've talked about as well is Ethereum and some confluence there, because if you look at Ethereum in 2016, it's actually mimicking 2024 quite closely, or 2024 is mimicking 2016. What I mean by that is that in 2016, ETH USD was green January, February, and March, just like it was green January, February, March of 2024. And then April was red. April was red. May was green. May was green. And then June, July, and August were red, right? June, July, and August were red. Then September for Ethereum actually ended up being green. So maybe you'll see the same thing happen again. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. There's still a chance that it goes down October through December. But that's at least something that would help support a potential green September, right? If Ethereum if Ethereum's green in September and it follows that 2016 sort of pattern, then it would raise the likelihood that Bitcoin is green in September, right? There's not many months, not saying there's none, but usually if Bitcoin is green, Ethereum is green, and if Bitcoin is red, Ethereum is red. And one of the ways that we can actually visualize that is to actually go look at the correlation coefficient matrix. If we just pull it up for crypto, stocks, and metals, you'll actually see that Bitcoin right here is pretty well correlated to Ethereum. It's got a correlation coefficient right now of 0.69 over the last 60 days. But if you look at it over the last, say, 365 days, Bitcoin's correlation to Ethereum is 0.96. So generally speaking, if Ethereum goes up, right, if Ethereum goes up in September of 2024, then there's a decent chance that Bitcoin would be green in September of 2024. So there's some evidence, right? I mean, again, it's seasonality. It doesn't always have to be bad, as we saw last year, right? As we saw last year, it doesn't always have to be bad. But just because we can look at this and say, well, it was green in 2016, and everyone's been making this comparison to, 2024 to 2016, could it be green here? The other thing that we've talked about a lot is comparing this cycle to 2019, because in 2019, the Fed cut rates, right? So if you were to overlay U.S. interest rates onto the chart, you'll know that 2019 was, in fact, a pivot year. And in 2019, Bitcoin, right, if you look at Bitcoin in 2019, it was actually red in September. But to go against what I just told you, right, to go against what I just told you, while Bitcoin was red in September of 2019, ETH was actually green. And it was actually in September of 2019 that ETH Bitcoin bottomed, and it's where Bitcoin dominance topped. Now, Bitcoin dominance topped after all Bitcoin pairs broke down, and after rate cuts, and after quantitative tightening ended. That hasn't actually happened yet, right? We still have not had rate cuts, although we're likely going to get one in a few weeks. But we also haven't seen the Fed pivot from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. You'll note right here in late 2019, that is right where Bitcoin dominance topped in September of 2019. I'm looking at it on a monthly, but if you go to the weekly and you overlay it right at the low, you'll see that right there, that's actually where Bitcoin dominance topped out in 2019. I'm not actually showing Bitcoin dominance, but if you've watched this channel at all, you'll know that September 2019 is where Bitcoin dominance topped out after the QT bull market that Bitcoin had back then. And then we went into the sort of the rate cuts and the other side of rate cuts, right? And they started cutting in July. So we saw Bitcoin dominance top in September, about a month and a half or so, about a little over a month after the Fed started to cut. So Bitcoin was green in 2016 of September of 2016, but it was actually red in 2019. So then I was thinking to myself, well, is there anything else, right? Is there anything else that we should think about, right? And the only other, the things that I would mention briefly as things that should be on your radar for September, the 2-year and the 10-year yields are almost uninverted. If you look at the 2-year, it's 3.921. The 10-year is 3.907. So they're actually really close to uninverting. And there's a non-negligible chance that in September, the yield curve, right, the 2-year and the 10-year, which is probably one of the two most popular treasury yield spreads to look at, there's a non-negligible chance it'll actually uninvert. Okay? I mean, you can see that some of this stuff is just rounding it to zero already. So there's a chance, right? There's a chance that you will see the 10-year and the 2-year uninvert in September, which could certainly change things. The other thing I want to mention for September are alt Bitcoin pairs, right? Because if you look at alt Bitcoin pairs last cycle, right? If you just look at them last cycle and you see kind of where they broke down they broke the first monthly close below support was 1 month before the first rate cut, right? It was 1 month before the first rate cut. It was in June. That was 1 month before the first rate cut. And then July, all Bitcoin pairs continued to go down, and they extended it even into August. And you can see that we're starting to have monthly closes below support over here. And coincidentally, the Fed's likely going to cut rates. So then, rather than just look at September of 2019, should we look at the month the Fed cut rates in 2019? What did Bitcoin do the month the Fed cut rates in 2019, right? And Bitcoin in the month the Fed cut rates was July of 2019. So let's go see what happened in July. You look at what happened in July. Actually, I need to go to monthly candles. Actually, let's first look at the weekly since we're here. If you look at July, you can see that Bitcoin first sold off, and then at the very end of the month, it got a bounce, right? So it mostly went nowhere, but I think it was slightly red if you look at the whole month. Right? If you look at the whole month of July in 2019, it was slightly red, negative 6% or so, which negative 6% would actually be about the average, because if you look at the average September return since 2010, it's negative 5.9%, right? Negative 6%. Now it's plus or minus 12.3%, but it's still around negative 6%, which is actually what Bitcoin did in the month that the Fed cut rates in 2019. It went down from the monthly open to the monthly close about 6%. So if we saw Bitcoin drop 6% this month, where would it be, right? It would take it to around 55K. Right? I mean, we've been there the last couple of months. Okay. They take it to around 55K. If you look at the month where all Bitcoin pairs, continued their breakdown in 2019, which was July, the month Fed cut rates, while it was a negative month, it wasn't catastrophic, right? It was negative 6%. And then September was negative 13.5%. Right? It's different, right? It's different. These sort of bear markets right here, the 2018 bear market and the 2022 bear market, look a lot different than these sort of, late business cycle after all the rate hikes are behind us and everyone's waiting on QE, right? This looks a lot different than this, right? Just like this looks a lot different than that. And I think the reasoning is because essentially what happens is you get your bear market, and then you get your bear market, and then you sort of get an impulsive move up in preparation for, the halving and QE eventually coming back. But then at some point, the market's kind of like, all right, when are you guys going to pivot, because the unemployment rates are not looking so great, and When's the QE actually going to come back? So then, Bitcoin does what it can do, and then it just sort of slowly bleeds, waiting on those rate cuts to actually arrive. And if they don't arrive quickly enough, then you can get hard landings, just like we got in 2020. Now, you could argue that was obviously induced by a pandemic, but there also are hard landings in the past that were induced by other things, right? And we are looking, as I mentioned, we are very close to an uninverted yield curve. Now, the 3-month is obviously nowhere close to inverting the 10-year, right? In fact, if you were to look at the treasury yield spread on that, 135 basis points, right? I mean, it's nowhere close in terms of like how far it is to the zero line. Now, it can change quickly. I don't mean to say that it can't. I mean, if you look at prior uninversions, sometimes it doesn't look like they're that far, and then all of a sudden they're uninverted. It depends on what happened. I mean, look at what happened in the .com era, right? I mean, it was all the way down here and negative, almost negative 100 basis points. And then in December, and then by the next month, it hit uninverted. So it can move quickly, right? It can move quickly depending on what actually happens. But I just want to put this video out because I put it out every year, and it feels like I can't not do it. I can't not put it out. I don't want to give people the wrong impression, because seasonality is one of those things that I would only put. I do think it's a thing, right? I mean, I do. I know a lot of people would debate that, and honestly, I think I could also take the other side of the debate actually as well, like, and make valid points, right? I mean, I could make valid points, I think, on the other side of the debate. And that's okay. But I do think there's something to be said for seasonality, just because August, September tend to be not the greatest months for Bitcoin, and we kind of see that happen time and time again. Occasionally there's a green month, but it's usually red. And then oftentimes, right, you'll see February, January and February tend to be better better for Bitcoin. If it's not, as long as it's not like, one of your main bear market years. But yeah, I think there's something to be said for seasonality, but it's not everything, right? It's like it's some confluence if you're looking for it, but it's not everything. And I can find evidence to support both views, right? I mean, I could go over to to Bitcoin, and in three of the looking at it, 3 of the last halving years, right? 2012, September was green. 2016. September was green. 2019, when the Fed cut rates, September was red. And in the month the Fed cut rates, Bitcoin was red. 2020, September was red. So 2 out of the last 3, right? 2 of the last 3 Septembers in halving years were actually green. But this is kind of going back to that old same debate, right? The same debate that, we've had over and over and over again. And it's essentially what matters more, the halving or monetary policy. I actually think it's a combination, right? You might think, oh, he only cares about monetary policy. I think it's a combination. I think the halving does play a role. I think monetary policy plays a role. And I think it's because you're getting those two things together. That's why this whole move here, it has elements of what you would expect after the halving, but it also has elements of what you saw last cycle after the 2019 sort of mid-cycle top after interest rates reached their peak. So it's really hard to say. And I know when I put these videos out, people are going to be like, well, you didn't really say what it's going to do. Well, I'll let you on a little secret. I don't know what it's going to do. I don't know. We're talking about the risks, right? We're talking about, what could it do based on what it has done. And if Ethereum follows its 2016 pattern, it could be green in September. But as 2019 showed us, Bitcoin was red in September and Ethereum was green. So while oftentimes if one's green, the other's green, 2019 says that's not always the case. Counterpoint though, 2019, when ETH was green in September, it was also when it was after the Fed cut by about 50 basis points. It was after the pivot from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. Now, what's interesting is we could get that pivot. I mean, there's a chance that the Fed, pivots really strong in a few weeks. Maybe they cut 50 basis points, and maybe they stop the balance sheet reduction. Probably isn't going to be my base case, but there's always a chance. And so it could play out in the same way that it played out in 2019 in terms of like Bitcoin dominance and ETH Bitcoin. But yeah, we'll see what happens. My guess is that whether it's green or red, it won't, it probably won't be, um, my guess is going to keep people guessing, right? It's not going to be one of those months um, where it's going to be obvious, right? And I think the reason is because, you know, as much as I've thought that the degens would have thrown in the towel by this point, they're still trying to hold on here. And I mean, it seems like when you look at all Bitcoin pairs, it seems like they're starting to lose their grip a little bit because now, you had a monthly close by all Bitcoin pairs in July at 0.39, and then we just saw them close at 0.38. So it's kind of like they're slowly fading. And I'm guessing you're just going to get a month soon where there's a big move to the downside. But it's so hard to know what month that's actually going to be. It could be September. And remember, in July 2019, when the Fed cut rates, alt Bitcoin pairs dropped. And it's crazy when you look at it because they opened the month at 0.38, which is exactly where all Bitcoin pairs opened this month. Isn't it interesting? July 2019, all Bitcoin pairs, 0.38. September 2024, all Bitcoin pairs, 0.38. In July of 2019, all Bitcoin pairs dropped to 0.29. They're low. They closed at 0.34. But it just goes to show, right? It just goes to show how similar things actually are when you have patience to watch the whole cycle play out. So, if you're asking me what I think's going to happen, I mean, I feel like I have to defer to all Bitcoin pairs and say, look, I think that no matter what direction Bitcoin goes, whether it's up or down, my guess is that alts keep bleeding back to Bitcoin. There's always a chance that they get a last minute move, kind of like Ethereum did in 2016, in September of 2016, right? But even if that happens, my guess is that this is still waiting for it on the other side, a Q4 bleed. So those are my views right now. And we'll see what happens, right? We'll see what happens. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the bull market support band, Bitcoin is still stuck in traffic on Struggle Street. Again, getting another weekly close below it. So it's another rejection. And at the end of the day, a rejection is a rejection. Right? These still just continue to be lower highs. So if that changes, we'll talk about it. But hasn't changed yet. Still seems very reminiscent of 2019. So we'll see where Bitcoin goes in the month of September. And it's interesting because, we'll talk a lot about Bitcoin, but I don't really think that's the story this month as much as, this video is about waking me up when September ends. I think the real story is what do all Bitcoin pairs do this month? Do they break down just like they broke down in 2019? We'll see. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.